I actually want to start today by thanking Scott for being the technical host for this session and for several other sessions as well. We greatly appreciate his technical expertise and support. Please do remember that this session is being recorded so that we can share it afterwards. And therefore, if you don't want your own image to be recorded, then simply just turn off your video camera. And that way we won't actually be able to record your image. So thank you very much for being here. And I want to welcome all of you to our second history tour, our tour of Kirtland. And of course, I do want to especially welcome Apostle Lachlan Mackay for joining us. Lach is the scheduled guest minister for Toronto Reunion that, of course, was supposed to begin today. And we are so grateful that Lach has been willing to do some things for us in our new online camping format. Excuse me. And I'm just going to briefly plug what Lach will be doing next week, starting on Monday for 5 days, Monday to Friday. He's going to be doing a history class. So please make sure that you tune in for the history class and, of course, for all the other events throughout the week of Toronto and the other events being planned for the other camps. Lach, thank you so much for your willingness to do this. The Nauvoo session was fantastic. I've really been looking forward to this one. And we appreciate so much your knowledge, your deep knowledge, and commitment to sharing the history and legacy of the church with us all. So over to you, Lach.
Very kind, David. Greatly appreciate it. It's a privilege to be with you. I spent 15 years living at Kirtland, managing Kirtland Temple and eventually all the historic sites. And I need to go back occasionally to give the tour so that I don't forget it. But tragically, of course, I have not been able to travel for some time now. So this is really helpful to make sure that I stay fresh on my Kirtland history. I love Kirtland Temple. It is the place where I consider that I had my conversion experience. I was baptized at 10, but I feel like converted at about 23 when I walked into the lower court of the Kirtland Temple for the first time. Had a wonderful experience with the Holy Spirit there, and many others through the years. I'm going to share my screen, and we're going to talk just a little bit about temple construction. The temple was built between 1833 and 1836. They hoped to build of brick, but many of the bricks crumbled as they fired them, and they were in trouble. Weren't quite sure what to do, but then Artemus Millet came down from Canada, woohoo, and saved the day. He was in the Kingston, Ontario area, Upper Canada, and brought with him this idea of building out of rubble stone construction. So they began to gather sandstone of various sizes and shapes, and using mortar to hold that stone together, they built a wall about 2 feet thick and about 45 feet high. You see the exposed rubble here as we were replacing the stucco in 1955. So they immediately cover that rubble with stucco, which they described early on as blue. I think it really was kind of a slate gray. And then they paint mortar joints on the wall. You could just barely see some of those painted joints. So the goal is to make it look like it's big cut stone block would be the most magnificent structure you could put up at the time if you could afford to cut and dress all that stone. Of course, they couldn't. So they created that look out of stucco and paint. They had sent young people out to gather old crockery and glass that was crushed even finer and dumped into the stucco so that when the sun hit it, it would sparkle brilliantly. The roof was wood shingles, likely dipped in a red lead paint to preserve them. And the front doors taken back a number of years ago to their original moderate olive green color. So blue-gray walls, reddish-brown roof, green front doors, pretty colorful early on. Unfortunately, toned down through the years, but really survived wonderfully and amazingly intact. They hope to build 2 more of these buildings just to the south of the temple. Section 91 of the Doctrine and Covenants describes their plans. The first building to the south was going to be a house for the presidency, or an office building. The second building to the south, a print shop for their printing operations. And the whole area from what is now Maple Street, just north of the temple, you can just see a little bit of it just to the right of the temple. Maple Street was then Whitney Street, to 1 block south, still Joseph Street today. That whole area was going to be their public square. And again, imagine 3 of these buildings filling that public square, and the community centered around that square. Now, interesting to note that we were going to fill the public square with sacred buildings, which didn't really play well in the US with this idea of separation of church and state. So normally, of course, you would put public buildings like a courthouse in your public square. So I think the roots of some of the conflict, particularly in Missouri and in Illinois, can be found in this community building vision of blending church and state, which again in the US doesn't play so well. Questions as I jump to our other screen. If you do have questions at any point, please just jump right in.
Please remember that everyone is muted, so if you do have a question, you need to unmute yourself. An easy way to do that is to hold down the space bar on your computer, and that will temporarily unmute you as long as you hold down the space bar.
All right, I'm going to try the screen share again.
Locke, who paid for this? I mean, was this essentially coming all out of the members simply contributing, or did the church proper pay something?
I think most of it is members contributing, and even like today with building projects, probably most of it, I think many contributed, but most of it came from some larger donors. People like the Tanner family or others who had significant resources they were able to help with. And in some ways, nobody paid for it, and to some extent. And what I mean by that is we ended up having to borrow money on it. So I guess it's still paid for, but we had to borrow $40,000 from Meade Stafford and Company, Buffalo merchants, and we mortgaged the temple as part of that. I guess that's a little different issue than who paid for it, though. But and I don't know if we were ever able to clear that mortgage. What's a little puzzling, though, or a little confusing, is that this is Geauga County, Ohio, in the 1830s, but in 1840, Lake County is split out and formed. So it's possible that the mortgage is registered when we're Geauga County and it's cleared in Lake County, but the records didn't survive. Probably $40,000 to $70,000 building at a time when a farmer and their family might make $12 to $40 a month. So pretty amazing. Other questions? We're going to see if we can wander through the temple. Let me move you and go to full screen. All right, are you inside the foyer now? Great.
Yes, indeed.
So we're going to do a virtual tour of the temple. You see the outer court. So these people are inspired by Old Testament tabernacle and temple language. So you walk into an outer court, and then through these doors, one here and one hidden behind, into an inner court. When you look up, you see a bell rope hanging here. They were trying to get a bell for the temple as early as 1835. W.W. Phelps, one of their leaders, said that a great effort was about to be undertaken to procure a bell for the Lord's house. I don't think that was accomplished, though, until 1890. That's the bell that's there now. We ring it on Sundays at 9 o'clock in the morning. There is some beautiful decorative woodwork in the temple, some amazing work, but depending on the age of the craftsmen, they had very different styles. At the time, when you apprenticed, you would go out and buy the latest edition of Asher Benjamin's architectural pattern books. So depending on your age, you bought different editions. And just like taste, style changes today, it did then. So if you were older, you apprenticed using the 1806 edition of Asher Benjamin's book, and it is very labor intensive. A lot of the kind of stuff that you see here, this is called fluting. It's grooves carved into the plank to form a pattern. So it is a lot of work. A guy named Jacob Bump seems to be in charge earlier. He's older, using that 1806 edition. So we'll see a lot of his work in the lower court or the first floor. But Bump got mad and left the church community for a time. And a man named Truman Angel seems to have finished up. He was younger. He was using the 1830 edition of the book. So you see more of his style here. This is a Greek fret, pieces of wood cut out and applied to form a geometric pattern. We'll see a lot more of that style on the second floor of the temple. We are going to climb virtually 33 steps and go to the second floor. And then we'll move into the upper court.
Was the 33 steps done on purpose?
We like to think it was done on purpose, but probably not. You know, sometimes we think maybe one step for each year of Christ's life. Sometimes people think for each degree of Freemasonic ritual. Joseph Smith would later in Nauvoo become very involved in Freemasonry, and it had a lot of impact on the rituals that our cousins in the Church of Jesus Christ do in their temples today. But I don't believe that there's really much Masonic influence in this building. So I, you know, maybe, but if they did it intentionally, they didn't write it down. They didn't tell us why. So the upper court, this was going to be the home of something called the School of Mine Apostles. As the name implies, it was intended to be classroom space, specifically for missionary and priesthood training. One of the more unique features of the temple are tiers of pulpits on both sides of the room. They're for the two priesthoods. You see here Aaronic priesthood pulpits. So PDA on the bottom is for the deacons quorum presidency. PTA for the teachers, PAP for the priests, and BPA on top for the bishops. I don't know exactly what those letters mean. They either didn't write it down in the 1830s or it didn't survive. So PDA might be presidents of the deacons of the Aaronic priesthood, or it might be presiding deacons of the order of Aaronic, or some other variation. My guess is of the Holy Order of God is worked in. It's probably a paragraph long. I just know it's the deacons quorum presidency. On the other end, we'll see Melchizedek priesthood pulpits. Of course, after Melchizedek, a high priest in the Hebrew Bible. On the bottom, a PEM for the elders quorum presidency, an MHP for the high priests, a PMH for the presidency of the Kirtland High Council. It's a little confusing. And then on top, I wonder if we can get up there. No, we'll back up. On top is a MPC for the first presidency, or the presidency over the entire church. They normally ignore these letters though, and would sit not by office, but rather by age, with older members up top, younger members down bottom. By Nauvoo in the 1840s, the letters have evolved. Lots of Q's mixed in by that time, certainly for quorum. And by the time those who go west build their St. George, Utah temple, the letters were a little different again. What's most important about them is that they were a teaching tool. everybody was a brand new member at this point, and every time they walk in, these letters would teach them the administrative structure of their new church. Again, we're in an inner court here, and we climb stairs in the outer court to get here. And if you look up, you see on the ceiling remnants of what they called curtains or veils, simply room dividers at this point in time. Again, more Hebrew Bible influence. The plan was to wrap canvas around these massive wooden rollers, and then using a system of ropes and pulleys that would go into the crawl spaces, down into the columns, and around windlasses inside these little doors. They hoped to put a crank on the side of this and start turning and crank these massive canvas curtains up and down. So they were going to drop curtains in this opening right in the middle of the room, as well as the opening running north-south. So one big classroom space was going to become 4 smaller ones. The idea is they hope to be able to teach 4 subjects at the same time. They never finished it on the 2nd floor. Downstairs, that system was in and functioning and used regularly. You'll notice that there really is no front nor back to the room. The benches are not attached. They slip back and forth to either side of the pew box, and these desks, which are later additions, flip up and lock into place so we can face either end depending on who's in charge at the time. The pew boxes, simply their New England heritage. So in many ways, this part of Ohio was called the New Connecticut or Connecticut Western Reserve. So one of the kings of England had given Connecticut a claim to all of the land from their western border to where the water flowed. Some would argue all the way across the country. So imagine this long, narrow strip that Connecticut claimed. After our Revolutionary War, in order to give up that claim, Connecticut was given this part of what would later become Ohio, but it couldn't be an extension of Connecticut. They had to sell it, and they did to land speculators. And the people who moved in were, in many cases, from Connecticut or New England in the US. So it's like, imagine picking up little New England villages and dropping them on the shores of Lake Erie. So lots and lots of New England cultural influence, including in the way that they built their worship spaces. So these pew boxes, really common in churches in New England at the time. Talked about the windlasses that would raise and lower. You see a better shot of some that actually got installed here. So there's a little metal rod sticking out here. Again, imagine turning a crank on that to raise and lower the veils. And then you see more examples of Greek frets. These are pieces of wood cut out and applied to the plank to form that geometric pattern. Other questions here?
There's no cushions on those hard pews. Is there any known reason for why that was decided to be that way?
No cushions on these hard pews. I don't know why. Now, it's possible that's because these are not the originals. Downstairs, which was not a classroom space, but a worship space, we'll see it in a little bit, there is a late reference to a couple of benches in the back that had what they believed to be the original upholstery still on them, the original cushions. So it's possible that they were padded downstairs. So I just don't have a good answer for you, but I can tell you that today in the lower court, they are padded. In the upper court, as you see, they are not. So much more often, whether it's worship or classes, we meet downstairs. Other questions?
You mentioned about the pew boxes being typical. Is the overall building typical? Are there other examples of this, or is it quite unique?
So overall, Kirtland Temple is very much a New England meeting house with some significant exceptions. The things that are distinctive, the things that make it different are the tiers of pulpits on both ends. That is quite uncommon. Another distinctive feature Windows are on every wall of every room, including interior walls like this one. And the reason they did that, for 100+ years in American church building tradition, you would build a pulpit and you would backlight it with what was called a Venetian or Palladian window. So when you spoke, you would be highlighted by that light behind you and to kind of draw attention to you. If you take one of these 9 pulpits, one of them, it's a very typical pulpit for the period, but stretching them 3 across and stacking them 3 high, not typical. The window, very typical, but suddenly you have this interior wall. So their solution is they put a big exterior window that we can't see out here that pulls light into this window to backlight the Aaronic pulpits. It also pulls light downstairs to backlight the Aaronic pulpits of the first floor. So really, I think kind of a nice solution to the problem of how can we backlight these pulpits as well. So the 3 distinctives: tiers of pulpits on both ends, windows on every wall, including the interiors. The third distinctive is the fact that we have 2 large rooms stacked, one on top of the other. Normally, your second floor, what you see here, would be a gallery or balcony, and people sitting up here on the sides or in the back would be looking down into the first floor. So instead, to have 2 rooms stacked, almost identical rooms stacked, very uncommon. And I believe that grows out of the fact that they built the temple for really just a few main reasons. One is they wanted to be empowered by the Holy Spirit in this place, what they called endowment. And endowment means something later in Nauvoo, but at this time they're turning to Luke and Acts, where Jesus tells his disciples to tarry in Jerusalem till they are endowed or clothed with power from on high. It's really important to them. The other thing is they didn't have enough money to pay rent on the meeting house that they were worshiping in. They needed a place to gather for Sunday worship, but they also had been commanded to train or educate their ministers. They need a place for a school. And so those 2 desperate needs, a place to worship and a place to educate their ministers, result in these 2 big rooms. Downstairs, the place to worship; upstairs, the place to educate the ministers. Really quite uncommon. There are lots of stories told about how Joseph Smith and Sidney Rigdon and Frederick Granger Williams, the first presidency of the church, saw this building in vision, and then they told the contractors what to build, and this is the result. I think that we've misunderstood that. I think they might well have had a vision, but it wasn't the building, it was the inner court. And they actually come back to the church with dimensions that are found in the Doctrine and Covenants, 55 feet by 65 feet. Well, that's not the dimensions for the building. That's the dimensions of these big interior rooms. And the distinctive features that we just talked about are all found in the inner court, in these inner rooms. So I think it's a combination of inspiration and the culture. So that's why I see both New England context or New England cultural influences and some really interesting, not common features. Great question. What else?
Who would be the people that, aside from the inspiration aspect, pulling all of this stuff together, like, having a window over the Aaronic pulpits and then a window behind that for the light to shine through? Like they thought of so much. Who were the primary architects, if you will, of the whole design?
Yeah, so I'm not really sure that architect was much of a thing in the US at the time, but there were master builders. Jacob Bump is one that I mentioned, and he knew how to build small frame structures. He was coming out of, I think it's Silverton, New York. So it's not far from Buffalo, but it's on the lower coast of Lake Erie there. And because he knew how to build small frame buildings, he did some things that proved to be problematic. So for example, the timbers under the lower court of this building are massive girders, massive wooden beams. They're rectangles. So of course they're strongest up and down where they're the thickest, but they were a lot easier to work with if they were laid flat. But you lose a fair amount of strength when you do that. Well, they laid them flat because that's what Bump knew how to do, small frame buildings. So by the 1880s, one account says that the first floor had an 11-inch sag in it, courtesy of laying that girder on its side. So again, he gets upset. Artemus Millet, this master mason from Canada, comes down, and I think Artemus kind of saves the day. He knew how to build massive stone structures. He was building mills and things like that up there. So he probably is responsible for the structure of the second floor, where they took those same massive timbers and laid them correctly, kept them upright. Others that were involved, I talked a little bit about Truman Angel. He's not so much a structure guy as imagine kind of a finish carpenter kind of guy at this point. I think Brigham Young and his brother made the windows. I think John Correll, who is described as an architect at times, is really more the kind of the supervisor of construction. So those are probably the most prominent names among the folks involved with building. We're going to climb another 33 steps. And we are in the third floor, where there are 5 attic offices or school rooms. The reason there are 5 of them, I wonder if I can illustrate this a little better. I'm going to drop back down. So notice these columns, like here, and columns here, and then we're standing next to some. There's, here. Imagine when we climb to the third floor, the walls that make these 5 long, thin offices, they're really king post trusses. So they needed a way to support the roof. We're in the attic on the third floor. So they wrapped the trusses with lath and plaster. And that's why there's these long, thin rooms. Each room upstairs is just as wide as the distance from column to column. So this bay is what becomes the room. And the trusses I talked about sit on top of each pair of columns. So imagine stone piers in the cellar, and then these wooden timbers run all the way through the building, and then up above, the trusses sit on top of each pair of columns. And so when that all comes together, you get the truss here. So there's a central timber, and that's why there are 2 windows instead of 1. There's braces that come up and braces that come down, and that's the structure that supports the roof. And again, behind it, the truss, the result, these long, thin offices. So another truss here, truss here. Again, 5 offices. They held what they called the Kirtland High School in these rooms in 1836 and 37. The students in this high school, though, ranged in age from children to adults, age 6 through adults. 3 departments. The first, the juvenile department, where they learned how to read and write. They also had a classics department, which was Latin and Greek languages, and an English department, not just English, but geography, grammar, arithmetic. Between those 3 departments, they had 135 to 140 people a day up here in class. Sidney Rigdon talked about what we were going to do with temples. Now he's talking Far West Temple, 1838, Missouri, which didn't get built, but what he said really applies to this one as well. He said, we are tired of our people being taken advantage of by the more learned. We're going to use the temple to teach them to read and write, to take care of themselves. So this idea of using education to protect the impoverished is rooted really early with us. And he specifically says both male and female, boy and girl, men and women. And that's what we did. They also held a Hebrew school here on the third floor of the temple. They hired a man named Joshua Satius to teach them Hebrew. He was really talented. They were very blessed to have found him. He had published his own textbooks, and so in one of those, you can find the word nauvoo, carrying with it connotations of beautiful. Of course, Joseph would later use that term. It shows up in Isaiah, a reference to beautiful mountains, would use that to name a city they established where I'm sitting today in Illinois. Church administrative quorums filled these rooms in the evenings. High priest Monday night, 70s Tuesday night, elders Wednesday night. And then finally, this room that we're standing in was Joseph Smith's office. It was there that the prayer of dedication for the temple was written and then delivered downstairs, where we'll go next. Questions on the third floor?
Do we know how this would have been lit?
How was it lit? So the primary light source is the windows on every wall, and they typically are gathering during the day. In theory, you could be here in the west room in the morning and get light from the rising sun in the east all the way through the building because of these interior windows that go in every room. They did meet in smaller groups at what they called early or first candlelight. It's that part of the day, I think, when you first start to need a candle to see. And they are selling lots of candle wicking at the N.K. Whitney store at the bottom of the hill, and not many lamp supplies. So whale oil an option, but expensive. I think, though, more candles than anything else.
Where do the little miniature doors go?
Where do those little miniature doors go? So this is a knee wall. So imagine the slope of the roof coming down. And then, of course, here's the floor. They took what would be wasted space between the roof and the floor, put a knee wall in, and then put a door in so you could access that as storage. So not really, other than storage, not really usable space. The Nauvoo temple, built in the 1840s, was about 60% larger than this one, and it was the same basic pattern. Although by that time, Joseph and Nauvoo had introduced baptism for the dead by proxy, so it had a finished basement with a font. They also did a queen post truss system in Nauvoo, which means instead of one central timber, they had two timbers pulled apart, which allowed, instead of all these walls, one big open room on the third floor of that temple. And finally, because it was bigger, what here is so small, or just little cubbies, little storage areas. In Nauvoo, these were big enough spaces that they put offices in there. Other questions?
How did they heat the building?
How did they heat the building? I think not very well. They had 4 wood-burning stoves in a cellar all the way underneath. In the winter months, you would see stovepipes. I wonder if I can find, I bet it's in the next room. They'd have stovepipes that would come through the floors all the way up through the building and eventually come together and out one central chimney. I think there's a patch from one of the pipes there. We leased the building as the folks headed to Missouri with the bank failure. And it was a 5-year lease to the Western Reserve Teachers Institute and Kirtland Seminary. After just a year or so, they moved out, complaining that there were too many steps and the temple was too hard to heat. It was pretty difficult.
These are all original floors.
Are these all original floors? By far, the majority of the flooring is original. The building really survived amazingly intact. What often would happen is if you have too much money, you modernize. So people gut these buildings to put in elevators and bathrooms and pipe organs. We just didn't have much money through the years. But also in the 1880s, when we started fixing up the temple, we decided we wanted to make it look just as it did. We were really focused on trying to make it look as it had in the 1830s. I'd like to think that we did that because we were cutting edge preservationists, but that was not our motivation. Instead, we believed that if we had the original temple and it looked just as it did originally, it would prove that we were the original church not those people in Utah. So it was rooted in identity issues. But as a result, even today, no bathrooms, for example, it really survived very much intact. Let's head to the first floor. So this is the lower court. Let's climb the pulpits, because it's probably something that most of you won't have a chance to do, but it is amazing. The perspective is something. So if you were in the very top center pulpit, this is what you would be seeing. This is typically where Joseph Smith Sr. sat, the father of the founder of the movement. So this is the lower court. It was the place where they would come to worship on Sundays. They would have hymns and sermons and prayers and testimonies. They would go home for lunch. They would come back for more hymns and prayers and sermons and testimonies. They would go home. Actually, they would also serve communion or sacrament. You see the sacrament table or the communion table here. There's one on both ends. These flip up and lock into place. After that afternoon session, you go home again, and then some would come back for choir practice. And there are lofts, 4 choir lofts, 1 in each corner. And they would sing from all 4 corners at the same time. There were curtains or veils in this room, in and functioning in the 1830s, but it was a different design to what they were trying to do upstairs. I think they got this one in, but it didn't work so well, so they redesign it, are in the process of installing it on the 2nd floor and never finish. Here, what they had were metal hooks set into the plaster, now gone, and then there was canvas suspended from the hooks, and then you see what looked like little white powdered donuts set into the ceiling. These had ropes going through them, and there was a system of windlasses and pulleys. And so the idea was, once again, you would be able to stand at one of the columns and crank away at a windlass, and using these ropes and pulleys, you could raise and lower these massive curtains. So just like upstairs, they're going to drop right down the center, as well as the center running north and south. So one big worship space becomes 4 smaller ones. They use these for Thursday prayer meetings. They'd fill up the room, drop the curtains, assign an elder to each corner, and have 4 prayer meetings going at the same time. Even with 4 going at once, some of these meetings would go from 10 in the morning to 3 or 4 in the afternoon. We talked about lighting earlier. On the lower court, we have physical evidence that they had candle burning chandeliers hanging. There's a metal hook right in the middle. Imagine some kind of a candle burning chandelier. They never describe it. We don't know if it'd be turned wood or tin, but the soot from the candles would rise and be tracked by those plaster rings. So it made cleaning a little easier. We have pictures later, this soot-filled rings up above. I talked about Jacob Bump earlier, the older guy using the earlier crafts or earlier edition of the pattern book. This beaded keystone right here in the center, kind of lost it. Well, I'll try and back up. That beaded keystone is a great example of Jacob Bump's style. It comes right out of the 1806 edition of the pattern book. So right here, it's kind of hard to see, but there are these beautiful little wooden beads carved in on both sides. So hugely labor intensive to create this keystone. Jacob Bump 1806 style. We're going to try and sprint to the other end. Woo! That didn't work so well. this keystone is flat. Just imagine a flat board with little holes drilled in it to form a pattern. So much, much simpler, much, much quicker than the one upstairs. So we think this is likely Truman Angel's style, the younger guy, the later pattern book, versus the Jacob Bump style on the other end. And on the columns here, these are fluted. Again, grooves cut into the pattern or into the surface of the plank to form the pattern. Remember, upstairs we saw frets, pieces of wood cut out and applied to form that pattern. These pew boxes are for visiting dignitaries. You see our hymnal collection. So people sitting in the sides might be the High Council of Missouri or the 7 presidents of 70. During the temple dedication, members of the Council of 12 were sitting on the side. They didn't actually have seats in the pulpits because they weren't supposed to be home. At the time, they were the traveling High Council, meaning they had authority basically in the rest of the world, but not where the church was organized. In Kirtland or in other places where the church was organized, it was the standing High Council who had authority. So really distinct lines of authority early on. Standing High Council in charge in stakes, traveling High Council or the apostles in charge in the rest of the world. It was in this room that the temple was dedicated, March 27th of 1836. For that service, they squeezed 900 to 1,000 people into this room. According to Joseph Smith, that was as many as could be comfortably situated. Children were on the laps of adults. Every seat and aisle were crowded. Their service lasted for 7 to 8 hours, with Sidney Rigdon preaching that day for 2.5 hours. Joseph Smith's prayer of dedication, about a half an hour long. There were months surrounding the temple dedication where the people were recording in their journals incredible spiritual experiences. They talk about the temple being filled with the sound of a mighty rushing wind. They talk of people speaking and singing in tongues, interpretations of tongues. They talk about seeing what looked like angelic figures dressed in white, walking back and forth across the rooftop. A Pentecostal season, this was described as. It really was a glorious time in the life of the church. Maybe the culmination of that, April 3rd, 1836. It's 1 week after the temple dedication. There's once again a Sunday afternoon service going on. Once again, 1,000 people present. The curtains out here are dropped, so this space is 4. They're blessing babies and confirming converts. While that's happening, Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery go into the pulpits to pray. They drop these massive canvas curtains around them for privacy. As they finish, they stand and they record a vision of the Lord on the breastwork of the pulpit before them, coming to accept the dedication of the house. So I think it's interesting that I often have thought we didn't pay attention to the Christian calendar, the liturgical calendar, until after Vatican II, beginning maybe 60s or 70s, 1960s or 70s. Then we and other non-Catholics started to engage a little bit with the Christian calendar. But I think it's fascinating that that vision that Joseph and Oliver had of the risen Lord, April 3rd of 1836, is Easter. That's Easter Sunday. And we sang for the first time 1 week earlier, on March 27th of 1836, at the dedication, "The Spirit of God like a fire is burning." And the chorus, of course, Hosanna, Hosanna, and that's Palm Sunday. So shouting Hosanna along with the rest of Christendom on Palm Sunday in Kirtland Temple. Questions?
How many people are in the church at this time?
How many people are in the church at the time? So there's probably 2,000 members living in the Kirtland Township at the time. And I am going to guess maybe 5,000 members, maybe a little more. Yeah, maybe a little more by this time. by the time Joseph's killed in 1844, there's probably 30,000 members around the world.
So, Locke, I just learned something new when you were talking about the vision that they had of Christ. I had always imagined that they were completely alone in the building at that time, and so when you described that, in fact, the room was separated with the curtains, but there were other people in other areas. Can you share a little bit about the circumstances of the visions involving Elijah?
Yeah, so that's the same experience: Christ, Moses, Elias, Elijah. And what I shared is two different journal accounts put together. So I should clarify that it's possible that all of these people left, but we don't have something saying that they did. What we have is a journal account saying, here's what's happening out here, and a journal account saying, here's what's happening here. So I do think that they're at the same time. So following the vision of the Lord on the breastwork of the pulpit before us, coming to accept the dedication of the house, are visions of Moses, Elias, Elijah. And so that same experience, same day, April 3rd of 1836. And it's Joseph's journal. And I think it's in the handwriting of Warren Parrish. I always forget Warren Parrish and Warren Calgary. I get them confused. But it's somebody who didn't stay with the church. But it's in their handwriting, the last entry in Joseph's Kirtland diary. Other questions?
So they did baptisms in the river, or there's water close by?
Yeah, there's a river down below, the east branch of the Chagrin River. So the temple sits on a river bluff, and then the east branch of the Chagrin River is down in the valley, and that's where they did baptisms if they could, although there are accounts of them going 6 miles to the frozen Lake Erie and chopping holes in the ice for baptisms. In the 1840s, here in Nauvoo, Joseph introduced baptism for the dead by proxy, done initially in the Mississippi River. There were some baptisms for the dead by proxy done in Kirtland in the Chagrin River. But fairly quickly, Joseph realized that people were really appreciated that opportunity, and he thought they probably were spending too much energy on that and not enough energy on building the Nauvoo Temple. So he fairly quickly said, you can't do that anymore until the Nauvoo Temple is finished. So they stopped doing them outside of the temple. Of course, Kirtland has no baptismal font in the temple. There is a cellar underneath this floor. It's about 6 feet deep with a dirt floor, so unfinished space.
How do you access the bell tower?
How do you access the bell tower? Let's see how close we can get. Got to say that that's not nearly as labor intensive as climbing the 66 steps. So this is an original window from the east end. Looks like that's as close as we're going to get. So those steps lead up into the bell tower. There's a door here, and then you keep going upstairs, and eventually you're in the tower. When I was there as an intern, Friday the 13th, must have been, I don't remember the month, but 1992, I was having dinner in a little building next door to the temple, and suddenly the phone rang, and it was the fire department saying that the temple was on fire and wanting somebody to meet them there to let them in, so they didn't have to take their axes to the front door. So I sprinted across. In the process of running, I lost my footwear. I think I was wearing sandals. Got to the front door just in time to meet them, and got the door open. They started dragging their hoses up 66 steps. They ran out of hose, had to get more going. We kept going. Right up above, there's a window just above this window, and you climb. So here's the trap door. That's how the bell got hauled up into the tower, one of maybe 4 trap doors. But there's a window just to the right, and you climb out of that window to get on the roof. But by the time they got up there, they wouldn't fit out the window because of their respirator and air tanks and etc. So they had to strip all that gear off, finally got onto the roof. And right up here, there was a small fire. What happened is there were painters at work on the bell tower. They had laid tarps over floodlights, which came on that night automatically on a timer and started a small fire. The damage was repaired in just a couple of days, but by chance, we were doing major work on the tower, so there was scaffolding wrapping it for a year. So in the minds of all the locals, the scaffolding on the bell tower is the result of this fire, and it was a major fire. The reality is it was pretty small, but it was pretty scary. We have been on fire at the temple many times through the years. On one occasion, in probably the 1880s, Cassie Kelly, who was married to, I always forget if it's I think it's E.L. Kelly, one of the apostles. He was gone for months at a time. So Cassie is the de facto caretaker of the temple. She came upstairs one morning and looked up, and this ceiling in the room next to the bell tower had burned out completely in the middle of the night. It was gone, but the fire had gone out. Probably, again, a problem with a stovepipe. On another occasion, Mr. Yaxley was tinning the bell tower roof, and coals from his furnace blew down and started several fires. They could get onto the roof and put that fire out, but some of the coals landed on the cornice, which is just outside this wall. So you're 45 feet up at this point. They, of course, couldn't reach the cornice, so they had to chop a hole through the wall. So the stone stops at this level, anything above is wood. So they had to chop a hole through the wall to get to the cornice to put out that fire. On another occasion in 1904, lightning struck McFarland's barn next door and hit the temple and set both ablaze. The locals came running, got a bucket brigade ready, but had to decide whether to save the barn or to save the temple. Fortunately, they chose the temple. Other questions?
How much of the temple as it is now is original material?
I'm just going to have to guess on how much of the temple is original material. Let me say that we have re-roofed multiple times, repainted, replastered, restuccoed. Windows in outside walls were removed and put in storage. So we still have the originals, but these are new, made to look old. Windows in interior walls, like this one, still original. So it's starting to sound like we've done a lot of work, and we have, but I'm guessing still 85 to 90% of the material, all the stone, all the timbers, the structure is still there. So it really is very intact. Now, there were times in the probably 60s and 70s when people like us would come through the temple and decide that it wasn't going to survive. And we decided to help out by saving small pieces for posterity, which is a nice way of saying people were stealing decorative woodwork. And so, for example, this chevron running along the side of the steps, most of those were stolen. But when you pull that off, the paint ghost makes it very clear what was there. So it was not hard to restore. But letters on the pulpits were stolen as well. But again, I'm talking about a lot of stuff that was taken, but the reality is it's really amazingly intact, right down to the original handrail you see on the left. The one on the right we put in later.
I learned in Sunday school 100 years ago that it was used as a barn at one time, and they stored hay in it. And
Yeah, we have said things like that. More often, our cousins in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints have said things like that. I don't think so. I think what happens is somebody's coming through in about 1859 and saying, well, I do think, let me clarify, I do think that at times the cellar, and there's a door just out here into the cellar underneath. Joseph III says that when he came through, it was open for the free ingress and egress of sheep and hogs. What I think he's really saying is that the doors were just left open at times. And at the time, you didn't fence animals in, you fenced animals out. And so there was no fence around the temple, so something could wander in and was there till it wandered out. I think part of that also is people didn't understand the pew boxes. And so because they are so far removed from New England culture eventually, they saw these pew boxes and decided that they were lambing pens. So I just don't think, I just don't find evidence to support the temple as barn tradition. I do find evidence to support at times the doors are just open. I also think some of that with our Utah cousins was an attempt to make them feel better about the fact that they were not able to hold on to it. It's true, it's not in our possession anymore, but it's okay because it's desecrated. It's not the Lord's house anymore, is the mindset, I think.
so who has the title to the temple now?
Who has the title to the temple now? So let me start really early. There are 4 strands of title, and all of them had some problems. At times, there are people selling the temple before there's any record that they own it. At times, the temple is in Joseph's name on behalf of the church, and at times the temple is in his name personally. When he is at risk of losing it to creditors in the 1830s, he signs it over to William Marks, the Kirtland stake president, who not long before Joseph's death signed it back to Joseph. So at Joseph's death, the temple is in his name in behalf of the church. After his death, as we begin to fragment, of course, we all want the temple. And so members of the Council of 12 convinced William Marks to sign a quitclaim deed, conveying what he had to them. What a quitclaim deed is saying, whatever claim I have, I give to you. So if my claim is clear, if I have clear ownership, now so do you. But if I don't have anything, neither do you. So what's the problem with William Marks signing a quitclaim to the 12 after Joseph's death?
He'd already signed it back to Joseph.
Yeah, he'd already signed it back to Joseph, so he didn't have anything to convey. But to try and strengthen that claim, the 12 then sell to George Edmonds Jr., a non-member friend of the church. And I think it goes for maybe $10,000. Then it sells to somebody else, and eventually it comes back to the 12 for maybe $1. So these are not real transactions. They're attempts to kind of strengthen the claim. James Strang gets involved in the picture. He soon has many followers in Kirtland. He's preaching for 8 hours at a stretch here. And he is saying, wait a minute, the deed says that the temple goes to Joseph and the first presidency. And remember that the 12 didn't create a first presidency initially. So Strang is saying, I'm the only claimant to the presidency, so clearly I own the temple. It got even more confusing in 1859 when Grandison Newell, who was public enemy #1, if you were a Latter-day Saint in Kirtland, he really didn't like us and we didn't like him. He convinces friends in the Ohio State Legislature to pass a law specifically so that Joseph Smith's properties could be sold to pay any debts resulting from the Kirtland Bank failure. So that eventually works its way through the courts. The temple and 13 acres sell on the courthouse steps for, I think it's $150. The guy who buys it happens to be Grandison Newell's grandson-in-law. He keeps the 13 acres free and clear and then sells just the temple to Russell Huntley and Joseph Smith III for $150. They think that they are buying it personally, and Joseph III is going to sell it to the city of Kirtland for a town hall. But Kirtland says, wait a minute, we don't think you own it. We think it's church property. And Joseph III backed up and said, yeah, I think you're right. So out of that grows the Kirtland Temple lawsuit of 1879 and 80. We have profoundly misunderstood this suit. Now, we had an attorney saying, if you don't do anything, the church will own the temple free and clear by 1881 through adverse possession, which in Ohio means if you possess something, proclaim to the world that you own it, somebody has 21 years to object. And if they don't, your cloudy ownership becomes clear through adverse possession. But instead of just waiting one more year, we decided to put together this lawsuit because really it wasn't about temple ownership for us. It was about, again, identity. It was about proving to the world that we were Joseph Smith Jr.'s church. So we put together this lawsuit. Unfortunately, our local council didn't show up, but we went ahead anyway. We had given the judge kind of our argument. Nobody showed up for the Mormons because it was in the middle of the cohabitation hunts, the polygamy hunts. They would have been arrested. The judge took our argument and just basically read it back to us. So he said, the reorganized church is the true and lawful successor to and entitled to the property thereof, Joseph Smith Jr.'s church. Wow, that's pretty good stuff for us. But then the judge said, but you filed the case wrong, case dismissed. What? So it's like it never happened. The Kirtland Temple suit has no legal bearing, almost certainly, but I'm not sure what happened. I think our attorney was so embarrassed that he lost the case where nobody showed up, that he just struck the last sentence of the judge's ruling and just sent the good language back west. That might be what happened, or maybe we knew and we just were not honest about it. I don't know. But many of us were raised with this Kirtland Temple suit finding, when it turns out it really, it was dismissed. It was like it didn't happen. But at the result of that, Joseph III gave possession to his church. So we had clear ownership as early as 1881 or as late as 1901, depending on how conservative your legal interpretation is. That was my longest answer. Anything else?
How often is the temple used now?
Well, right now it's not used at all.
No.
We're shut down for COVID, but typically about once a week, some kind of service or class.
And what is the membership in Kirtland?
Membership in Kirtland is probably 50, 60, maybe more. At times it's been a really big congregation, but it's been really big because it turns out we were very intentional about encouraging people to gather there. So in the 1880s, there was a significant focus on gathering. I think that happened again in the 1920s. Now, it's really expensive to live in Kirtland if you've not been there for a long time. It's a very desirable place to be. And there's also, our congregation's fortunes rise and fall with the economy. So I'm guessing there might be 100 on the rolls, but there's probably 30 to 50 that are active. if I can figure out how to do it, I'm going to stop my screen share and see if you have any other questions.
All of your answers have been so detailed. Is it written down, all the history of the ownership and all that kind of thing? Is that written down or not?
So the history of the ownership is written down by Kim Loving, who was our stake president in Kirtland years ago, an attorney, and it's in a Mormon History Association journal. So I think you can find it online if you would Google Kim Loving Kirtland Temple ownership. I think you can find that article. So what I've shared comes from lots of different sources. Barbara Walden and I have an illustrated history of the Kirtland Temple, which is through Herald House, I think, which is just kind of a small, lots of photographs book, but some of it's in there. Maybe the best book on Kirtland right now, though, is probably Mark Staker's Hearken, O Ye People, which is a really nice history of the church in Kirtland.
How many visitors do we get in a year in normal times?
How many visitors in a normal year? Probably 28 to 40, kind of ranges somewhere in there. 1,000, let me clarify, 1,000.
How is it heated now?
How's it heated now? So I love your backdrop now. Sorry, I just joined the, we have boilers, natural gas fired boilers outside the building. So years ago, we decided to move all combustion out of the building. Early on, early meaning early 20th century, we had a boiler across the street in the congregation, and then steam pipes going through a tunnel under the street to the temple. The locals talk about how new kids in town, you'd invite them to go sledding by holding onto the back of the bumpers of cars, and they'd kind of pull you along the snow-covered street, and you would trick them because you wouldn't tell them about the part where the steam tunnel was, where of course there was no snow on top of it. What a terrible thing to do to the other kids. But now the boilers are just next to the temple outside. And a number of years ago, it's been quite a while now, then President Hinckley of the LDS Church was in Nauvoo for the dedication of the Nauvoo Temple reconstructed. And by chance, he came to a memorial service that we have done every year on June 27 for Joseph and Hiram Smith, the day that they were assassinated. And he was talking to President McMurray at that service and commented that he knew that there were a lot of LDS visitors coming through Kirtland and he'd like to help somehow, and offered to make a contribution. So he was kind enough to send $25,000, which our Historic Sites Foundation matched. So we took that $50,000 and put a new heat system in. So really high tech, again, combustion outside, but all the controls in the cellar of the temple, and paid for in part by the generosity of our friends in the LDS Church.
You said earlier there were no bathrooms in the temple originally. Are there any there now?
There are still no bathrooms in the temple.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I'd hate to, you'd have to gut it, and something, you'd have to tear up something pretty significantly to put them in. The part that I don't feel good about is it's also not accessible.
Was the bell installed shortly after the completion of the building?
So the bell was supposed to be installed maybe even before the completion of the building, but I don't think they get it until 1890.
Did the bell that was installed have a particular significance?
No, the bell that was installed is the one that's still there, and they got it on sale from the Buckeye Bell Foundry in Cincinnati, Ohio, because somebody else had ordered it and then didn't pay for it. It weighs either 1,000 or just over 1,000 pounds.
Do you still use it at all?
We still use it Sunday mornings at 9 o'clock. We ring it 50 times to call the locals to worship. So this is my first attempt at a guided virtual tour. What would make it better? Did anybody get seasick? Except me?
No, it was great.
Any feedback would be appreciated. because I think we're going to have to. So we are doing Zoom-based tours 5 days a week in Kirtland. So you can go to the kirtlandtemple.org site, and Seth Bryant, it's generally at 2 o'clock Eastern. There's a small preservation fee, but you can walk through the temple with Seth and using the chat feature, ask questions. So it's a little different than this experience because we were using, of course, the pre-recorded 3D virtual tour. With Seth, you'd actually be live Zoom.
I noticed you had a couple of other floors there. Do you actually have footage of the in-between floors?
So I don't, well, let me look. Maybe. So the other floors are the interstitial spaces created by the vaulted ceilings. So if you want a curved ceiling and you want a flat floor on top of it, then by default, you're going to have space on either side. And the way that the 3D modeling worked, the only way they could account for the space is to call it another floor. So what it really is the crawl spaces in between. Let me see if I have something in a PowerPoint. You know, they were planning a temple in Independence, Missouri at the same time, but it was going to be a little different. There are architectural drawings of that building that survived. It's really long and low and shed-like. And what was happening is that they forgot, because they weren't master builders, they forgot that a crawl space takes up space, or a ceiling vault takes up space. They forgot that floors are thicker than a pencil line. They forgot that ceiling joists are thicker than a pencil line. So if you raise the roof of their architectural drawing to account for the structure and for the curved ceilings, then you get something very much like the Kirtland Temple. Turns out I don't have a photograph of the space, but it is, well, it's not very exciting. You poke your head in and you look right, and you'll see the back side of that wooden vault. And if you look the other direction, you're going to see the exposed rubble wall. And it's probably just over 5 feet high in there. So I might be able to just barely stand. Well, no, I can't stand up in there, but it's close.
Look, I'm not sure how difficult it would be to go from the temple tour that we did to stills, because you had the, you tried to show the end fretwork, and we're having, had a little bit of difficulty. So I'm wondering whether having a few stills of some things, like that was interesting too, the question about the crawl space. So having a few stills, but can you get in and out? I don't know.
So you can, but it's a little cumbersome. So I do have some of those. So let's try it if I can do a screen share. Let me know if you can see my screen now.
You're up.
Great.
Yep.
So I think it works usually, but not always. So that interstitial space I was talking about, what the program labels as other floors. So this would be floor 2, but it's really just the space in between. Is my cursor showing up?
Yes,
Yes.
it is. Yep.
Great. Let's see what else. There's the frets. So these are details from the architectural manuals. You see an engraving on the left and then the actual temple window on the right. Aha, there we go.
Oh, see, that's perfect.
Yeah. So if I made a PowerPoint with just a few features like that that are hard to zero in on, I think that would work well. I appreciate that suggestion. This would be a good one to show you too. We put the veils back in. So this is not the original system, but gives you some idea of what it might have looked like. You see up near the ceiling. The sun destroyed the canvas eventually. These are some of the groups that were coming and going through the 1840s and 50s. Latter-day Saints of different varieties. Our current branch, our current congregation dates to 1886. Here's the chains of title we talked about. Pretty messy. Pains me that we had that sign on the front for the longest time. Can you read that? Built by the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, 1834. Reorganized Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in succession by order of the court. Well, not really.
Oops.
Yeah. Anything else?
The various places that you showed us that would not be on a normal tour, like the storage spaces and the floors between the floors and so forth, are all those areas, would you say, still structurally sound?
Yeah, I'd say the temple is more structurally sound today than it has ever been because we've done a lot of strengthening. So for example, on the third floor, they in the 1830s installed the floor joists 3 feet apart when they should have been maybe 12, 16 inches. I don't know, not nearly as wide as that. And so we limit pretty carefully. We added additional joists, but still limit the number of people that they put up there. They had the same problem in Nauvoo. They had the second meeting of 200 plus people on the third floor of the Nauvoo temple. By the end of the meeting, the doors would no longer close and the plaster was falling off the walls. The walls, the sandstone walls, really only started about 2 foot thick. So today you build a footer, a wide base to spread the weight out, and then the narrow wall would sit on that. That they didn't understand that. And so we did compaction grouting to inject kind of concrete kind of stuff into the ground underneath the walls and the piers to strengthen it. They took these beautiful floor joists, maybe 12 inches, but notched the end down to insert them into some of the timbers. So lost half the strength in some cases, and they have a tendency to fail, to split. So we put metal joist hangers throughout the building, ceiling joist hangers, floor joist hangers. So structurally, it's in pretty good shape. Now, having said that, we do get earthquakes in Kirtland, and it is, you know, the compaction grouting that we did helps, but I would not say that it is seismically retrofitted in a way that would withstand a major quake. And the reality is we just don't have the money to do that.
You were saying earlier that somebody sold the temple back of the 13 acres or whatever it is. So did they ever get the rest of the land under the same title, or?
No, so we never went back and tried to squabble over the 13 acres.
If you're talking about things that might enhance the presentation, it would be fabulous if you had some drone footage of flying around showing the outside of the temple, just sort of where it's situated and all that would definitely add.
So we do, come to think of it, and we also have drone footage inside the temple as I think that through. So I'll see what I can do.
Drone footage inside the temple. That sounds dangerous.
Yeah, it was. It was a production company that was doing what was it? Well, it was some television production. Yeah. Probably about as dangerous as some of the rigs that our friends in the Church of Jesus Christ have set up. I don't know if any of you have spent time on film sets, but they build these really elaborate tracks for camera dollies so they can get these beautiful, long, smooth shots. And some of them were built, 15 foot up across the room, across the top of the pulpits, and pretty amazing. We try desperately to be very careful, though.
You live in Kirtland.
I lived in Kirtland for 15 years, and then in 2007 moved to Nauvoo.
Okay. And your assignment as apostle is?
My assignment is the Northeast US field. So basically Michigan to Maine to Virginia. And then I also have as a functional assignment, historic sites and the church history and sacred story team.
Yeah, they can't ever take that away from you. It's just, you're just wonderful.
Very kind.
And a wonderful teacher.
I love the story.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you.
I feel like if we were going to write a foundational story to support today's missional focus, it would be hard to write a better one than the one we inherited. You know, our rootedness in violence and poverty and persecution, I think if we let it, really can inform what we're trying to do today. And I think there's so many lessons from our past that can improve the world in which we live today if we will just listen.
Lachlan, did you mention the visitor center? I missed the very first of this production.
I didn't. Our virtual tour doesn't include it, but it is a wonderful, beautiful building. Opened in 2007. Kind of what I worked towards with lots of help from lots of talented people and lots of generous donors, including wonderfully generous Canadian donors. But we managed to get the visitor center dedicated in 2007. And then I packed the moving truck the next week to move to Nauvoo. Never even got to move into my office.
When you do the history lesson next week, will part of that be this?
There will definitely be some crossover, but we won't actually do the tour like this, simply because we just did. But I'll probably delve more into things like the Kirtland Bank, probably talk quite a bit about the concept of endowment or spiritual empowerment that was so critically important to them. I'll probably talk, and hopefully answer lots of questions then too. But we won't do the virtual tour next week.
You were talking about the visitor center. I was down there for a conference with David Brock with the evangelists, and we're in this one room, and there's a window there that had curtains on it, and we were all sitting there, and he opened the picture window, and there the whole temple was right in front of us. Beautiful, beautiful experience.
It's pretty amazing, inspired by Disney World.
Wow.
The last time I was there, Lachlan, was probably around 1970 when my father was living. And I remember he was very interested in the dugout, the basement part. I remember the big stones. And then he and I went right up outside into the bell tower where you got a bird's eye view of everything. I understand you can't go up there now.
Well, we do offer now a basement to bell tower behind the scenes tour. So it's very small groups, appropriately dressed, and we actually probably don't take the tours outside on the bell tower, but we let them climb up and poke their head out of the hatch.
Oh, we stood right up there and looked right around. It was beautiful.
One of my fondest Kirtland memories, for years, we would watch fireworks on our national holidays from the top of the bell tower.
Oh, wow. Nice. It's nice the way it's been kept up since, well, like 1970. If I were to go back, I'm sure I'd be very proud of how it's been kept up.
Looks pretty good. I mean, as you can guess, it's hugely expensive to maintain historic buildings.
Yes.
So, you know, like the paint, the sandstone around the windows and the doors has iron in it, it rusts. And so rust streaks start running down the sides and the front. They didn't understand expansion joints yet. So they didn't build in expansion joints into the stone walls, which means the temple built them in itself, which these cracks that run between the windows. We just keep them sealed up with a flexible sealer. But in order to stay flexible, to keep the moisture out, it's also kind of tacky, which means dust sticks to it. So it looks like there's these horrific cracks in the walls, and there are cracks in the walls, but they look much worse than they really are. Those kinds of things need constant attention. It's a big job and getting bigger all the time.
At that time, the guide that took us through was so proud of, he felt it was quite prophetic that when they went to put in the lights around the edges of that, it just seemed like it was prepared to receive those lights.
So, yeah, I think there is inspiration, but I don't believe the inspiration was leave these spaces for no apparent reason so we could put in lights later or put in air conditioning later, or you hear similar stories about the Salt Lake Temple so we could put in elevators later. I think the inspiration is let's put in vaulted ceilings, which means we have these wonderful crawl spaces on either side of the vault, which makes it much easier to retrofit for things like air conditioning and lights and et cetera.
Well, as the bishop in residence, I will take your comments as suggesting that we all can help support some of that cost by going to the historic sites and making a contribution.
Yeah, that would be greatly appreciated. So as of the 2021 budget, we have been asked to be self-sufficient, meaning we need to raise as much income as we spend. And in a normal year, we can do that or get close between preservation fees and museum store sales and rental income and donations. These are not normal years, so I'm not sure what that's going to look like if we can't open. But yeah, your generous support would be greatly appreciated and very helpful.
Do you rent the temple out to third parties?
We do, but it's a relatively nominal rent. So we made the decision in the early 90s, and had done it a little bit before that, but that we would welcome others who share this heritage to worship there as well. So many of the groups that come are Community of Christ, but we also welcome restorationist groups and members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and I think we've had Strangites and Bickertonites and others as well. So we do welcome them. I think it's like $100 per hour and then maybe $2 per person or something. It's not, it's not really a money-making venture, although we might have to rethink that. It really is simply to help offset some of the expenses. What does generate significant income now is our preservation fee, which we've had to increase through the years. And I think we're at $10 a person in 2020 before we close. I think that's what we'll stay at. In the scheme of things, that's not that much money. If you go to Westminster Abbey, I think it's like $30 or $50 now. And to tour museum homes in the US anyway, it's often 15 or 20 or more. But having said that, a lot of our visitors simply aren't used to paying anything to see church historic sites. So it's a bit of a challenge, but not bad. Most folks are happy to help.
You may have already mentioned the roof. What is the material?
The roof is wood shingles and would have been early on at some point to try and save some money and maybe to try and make it more lightning proof. We put slate on, but we didn't consider how heavy slate is and how under-engineered the roof structure was. And so it did not go particularly well. And eventually we had to take the slate off and go back to wood.
Locke, what is the best way to make a contribution? Is it to visit the Kirtland Temple website?
You can contribute through the Kirtland Temple website or through the Community Priced Historic Sites Foundation website. I'm trying to think, though, as Canadians, maybe our good bishop knows what's the best way. There's probably no good way to get a tax benefit. Is that right?
I was thinking that one, and we should check into that, and we'll let people know.
Wonderful. Well, Locke, this has been great. We are at 3:30. Do we have any final comments or questions for Locke?
It's been a privilege. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Locke. We really appreciate your knowledge and your wisdom and all your efforts to keep Kirtland Temple going.
Very kind. See everybody Monday.
All right. Take care, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you.
I know. See you Monday.
Yep.
Thank you.